April 15th, 1912, 2:20 a.m. The richest passenger on the Titanic enters the Atlantic Ocean. Jacob Astor IV was worth about $87 million. At the time, one of the largest private fortunes on Earth. Built almost entirely from New York land his family had been collecting since the 1700s. His death was reported around the world. What wasn't reported was that his family's power had already started slipping before the ship even sailed. In 1811, New York approved the Commissioner's Street Grid, a map of a future city stretching far beyond its population. Most people thought it was fantasy farmland planning. The Astors started buying it immediately. By the late 1800s, they controlled vast portions of Manhattan real estate. Entire blocks were leased, not sold. Businesses paid them. Immigrants paid them. Even other millionaires paid them. Along Fifth Avenue facing Central Park, their mansions formed an unbroken defensive line of marble, while the workers supporting that economy lived in overcrowded tenements only streets away. Then the 20th century arrived faster than their model of wealth could adapt. 1913, federal income tax. 1900s elevators. Cities grow upward instead of outward. 1920s corporate ownership replaces family estates. Within a few decades, developers earned more by demolishing Astor palaces than maintaining them. No scandal destroyed the family. No crash bankrupted them. Their advantage simply stopped being an advantage. They had spent a century predicting where New York would expand. But what happens to a dynasty built on owning the future? When the future changes faster than ownership itself. If you value deeply researched stories about forgotten Gilded Age wealth, power, and the architecture that shaped history, consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments which estate or dynasty you want explored next. Chapter 1. The Man Who Bought a Wilderness. In November 1784, a 19-year-old butcher's son stepped off a ship in New York Harbor. His name was Jacob Astor. He spoke limited English, carried almost no money, and arrived in a country that had only existed as an independent nation for a single year. New York was not a metropolis then. Its population was barely 30,000 people, smaller than many modern neighborhoods. The island north of present-day Canal Street was farmland, rocky hills, and scattered estates. Above it stretched miles of forest and swamp. Astor did not come to build a business inside the city. He came because of something outside it. On the voyage from London, another passenger explained how fortunes were being made in North America's fur trade. Beaver pelts were in extreme demand in Europe, used for waterproof felt hats. The supply chain stretched thousands of miles, from indigenous trappers in the interior through frontier traders into coastal export merchants. Most immigrants heard opportunities in that story. Astor heard structure. Within a few years, he wasn't trapping animals himself. He positioned himself between everyone else, buying from hunters, supplying traders, exporting to London, and reinvesting profits into controlling distribution routes. By the 1790s, he had become one of the most efficient middlemen in the Atlantic trade. Then geopolitics helped him. The Jay Treaty of 1794 stabilized trade between the United States and Britain. While many merchants cautiously expanded, Astor aggressively scaled. He secured contacts in Montreal and London simultaneously, allowing him to operate across borders that competitors treated as barriers. He didn't compete with traders. He absorbed them. By the early 1800s, he founded the American Fur Company, consolidating smaller operations into a network stretching toward the Great Lakes and beyond. Government officials needed supplies in frontier territories. He supplied them. Expeditions required logistics. He financed them. Remote trading posts depended on credit. He controlled it. At its peak, his network dominated large portions of the North American fur export market. But the fur trade wasn't the end of the strategy. It was the first phase. Around 1800, while profits surged, Astor began quietly buying land on Manhattan Island. Not mansions, not commercial buildings. Land, often undeveloped, unpopular, and far from the crowded southern tip of the city. Contemporaries considered these purchases strange. The wealthy wanted proximity to the harbor, the markets, the banks. Uptown land was inconvenient in the countryside. He kept buying it anyway. The reason becomes clearer when you look at the timeline. New York's population doubled between 1790 and 1800, then doubled again by 1810. Immigration, trade expansion, and shipping growth were compressing people into the southern streets. The city could not stay small. In 1811, city planners approved the commissioner's plan, a rigid grid of future streets extending miles north into empty terrain. Astor had already been purchasing property there for years. He wasn't reacting to growth. He was waiting for it. Unlike most landowners, he refused to sell parcels outright. He leased them, long-term ground leases that allowed tenants to build while the family retained ownership of the soil itself. Buildings could age, burn, or be demolished. The land would always reset to the landlord. This created a different kind of wealth. Merchants earned from trade. Industrialists earned from production. Astor earned from time. By the 1820s, fur profits began declining as fashion shifted away from beaver hats. Many traders lost fortunes. Astor exited early and moved capital into property almost completely. It looked like retirement. It was a consolidation. By the time of his death in 1848, his estate was worth over $20 million, an amount so large it rivaled significant portions of the young federal government's annual revenue, much of it tied to Manhattan ground leases. He had not invented a technology. He had not transformed manufacturing, that he had purchased the future location of other people's lives. And that decision shaped the family that followed him. They would inherit wealth that did not depend on innovation, competition, or even participation, only on the certainty that the city would continue to expand. Astor understood something rare for his time. Cities grow predictably, but people think short-term. So he positioned himself decades ahead of them. New York's residents believed they were building their own livelihoods. Increasingly, they were building value on land already claimed. While others saw forests and farms, Astor saw tenants. Chapter 2. The Map That Erased the Poor. March 22, 1811. New York City approves a plan that looks simple on paper and brutal in real life. A rigid grid of straight streets carved across Manhattan. 12 avenues running north-south. Cross streets numbered like inventory. The map did not ask permission from the island's hills, farms, streams, or estates. It didn't care about existing roads or property lines. The point was not beauty. The point was control. Because once the grid existed, Manhattan stopped being a place that grew. It became a place that would be forced to grow in a specific direction. To most people in 1811, the plan looked unrealistic. The city's dense life still clung to the southern tip. Everything north of what people considered town was open land, scattered farms, rocky ridges, and emptiness. The grid stretched far beyond current population needs, like someone drawing streets for a city that didn't exist. But that was exactly what it was. A blueprint for a future population. And a blueprint creates a new kind of opportunity. Not to build the city, but to own it before it arrives. Jacob Astor understood what the map really meant. Not roads. Not convenience. Certainty. If the city officially promised that certain lines would become streets, then the land along those lines became predictable value. You no longer had to guess where people would move. You didn't need to be lucky. You just needed to be early. Astor had been buying land uptown before the plan was finalized. Parcels that seemed useless suddenly became inevitable. A field becomes a block. A block becomes shops. Shops become apartments. Apartments become a neighborhood. Most men saw empty land and asked, who would live here? Astor asked, how long until they have no choice? And then he built the most important part of his empire. Not ownership, dependence. Because he didn't sell. He leased. A sale is a one-time victory. A lease is a permanent relationship. Under long-term ground leases, tenants could build structures on Astor land, homes, shops, warehouses, while paying annual rent for the ground beneath. They could improve buildings, expand businesses, and raise the property's value through their own risk. But the soil stayed Astor's. If the business succeeded, the tenant earned profit, until the lease renewal raised rent. If the business failed, a new tenant replaced them, and the land continued producing income. If a building burned, the tenant rebuilt, because the location was still valuable. The risk belonged to the people living inside the city. The reward belonged to the people who owned the map's future. This model didn't just generate money. It generated a kind of economic gravity. Because Manhattan isn't like farmland. In farmland, people can move outward. In a dense city, people move toward opportunity, toward jobs, transport, markets, and customers. The grid turned that movement into a predictable flow, and Astor positioned himself beneath it. As the 1800s progressed, New York's population exploded. Immigration and trade packed the southern streets until expansion north was not optional, it was necessary. The city began activating the grid like a machine turning on one section at a time. Each new street opened meant development pressure. Each development pressure meant demand for land. And in many places, that land wasn't being offered for true ownership. It was being offered as permission. That's the dark side people rarely say out loud. The Astors didn't just profit from New York's growth. They structured it so that growth produced dependence by default. A merchant could build a shop and believe he owned his future. But if the ground was leased, his future was conditional. A family could build a home and believe it was security. But if the ground was leased, security had an expiration date. Over time, the leases normalized a city where people owned walls, but not permanence. They owned what could be destroyed, but not what couldn't be replaced. And because New York kept growing, the system became harder to escape. Success meant staying near the center. Staying near the center meant paying for access. Paying for access meant feeding the landlords who predicted the center first. This is how landlord capitalism becomes invisible. It doesn't feel like force. It feels like the way the city works. By the mid-1800s, you didn't have to know Astor's name to live inside Astor's logic. You just had to need Manhattan. That's why the commissioner's plan mattered so much. It didn't merely organize streets. It organized destiny. It made New York legible to speculators decades before ordinary residents even arrived. The grid transformed Manhattan from land into a schedule. And Astor treated that schedule like an investment. New York wasn't growing naturally. It was growing according to one man's prediction. Chapter 3: The First American Billionaire. When Johann Jacob Astor died in 1848, the number attached to his estate confused Americans. $20 million. At a time when the entire federal government spent roughly that amount in a year. But the scale was not the unusual part. The structure was, most fortunes in early America were active. A merchant needed ships moving. A mill owner needed workers producing. A banker needed borrowers paying interest. Income stopped when activity stopped. Astor's income did not depend on activity continuing, only on space remaining occupied. Across Manhattan, he had arranged long-term ground leases instead of property sales. A typical agreement allowed a tenant to construct a building while paying annual rent for the land underneath. The tenant financed construction, maintenance, repairs, and taxes on the structure. But the land always returned to the landlord. If a shop failed, another replaced it. If a house burned, another was built. If a neighborhood improved, rent increased automatically at renewal. The person taking the risk changed. The person collecting value did not be by the 1850s. Large portions of lower and mid-Manhattan operated under versions of this system. Streets developed by merchants and residents generated income for an owner who did not participate in the businesses operating there. This produced a different financial behavior from industrial wealth. A factory owner reinvested constantly to survive competition. A landlord reinvested rarely because the city reinvested for him. As immigration accelerated, New York's population multiplied, from roughly 60,000 in 1800 to over 500,000 by mid-century. Every increase required housing, shops, storage, and offices. Each requirement activated leased land. The family did not need to predict which businesses would succeed. They only needed to know people would exist somewhere. The advantage became clearer during economic downturns. Commercial panics periodically collapsed trade networks and bank credit. Merchants lost inventory. Manufacturers shut workshops. But tenants still needed locations to attempt recovery. Reduced profit did not eliminate the need for premises, it changed who occupied them. Vacancy rarely lasted long in a growing port. This stability produced wealth without operational expertise. The heirs did not need to understand shipping routes, commodity pricing, or manufacturing processes. They needed accountants and legal agreements. By the late 19th century, new industrial fortunes appeared larger in yearly earnings: railroads, oil, steel, but they required constant supervision and faced technological replacement. The Astor estate expanded slower, yet it demanded less intervention and carried less volatility. Their income resembled taxation more than business profit. Participation in the city required occupying space. Occupying space required paying someone who owned it before demand existed. The more successful the city became, the stronger the arrangement grew. In a republic built on rejecting inherited rank, this created an inherited advantage independent of talent. Ability determined who prospered within buildings. Ownership determined who prospered from the buildings themselves. The family did not control every enterprise operating on their land. They controlled the condition allowing enterprises to operate at all. America had eliminated legal aristocracy. But concentrated urban land produced a functional equivalent, influence derived not from commanding people directly, but from owning the ground beneath their opportunities. The Astors didn't produce wealth, they taxed existence. Chapter 4, Fifth Avenue. The social cage. By the late 1800s, the Astors were no longer the richest Americans. Railroads, steel, and oil had created men with bigger numbers than any landlord dynasty could match. Vanderbilt money built fleets and stations. Carnegie money poured into furnaces. Rockefeller money reorganized an entire commodity. But New York didn't run on money alone. It ran on permission. And permission had an address: Fifth Avenue. At the center of that address stood Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, Mrs. Astor. She wasn't the family's most powerful landlord. She wasn't the head of a corporation. She didn't need to be, because she controlled the one thing new money couldn't manufacture: legitimacy. In an America that claimed it had no aristocracy, New York quietly built one anyway. Not with titles, but with doors that stayed closed. Mrs. Astor's ballroom became a checkpoint. If you were welcomed there, you existed. If you weren't, your wealth stayed trapped in the wrong world. Useful for business, useless for belonging. This is where the 400 was born. The number was simple, roughly the capacity of her ballroom. A physical limit turned into a social law. 400 names. Not 400 families who were nice. 400 who were safe, old enough, connected enough, approved. Everyone else was noisy. And people found out the hard way. A newly rich industrialist could donate to hospitals, fund museums, build railroads, and still watch his wife stand alone at a reception, smiles tightening around her like a trap. Not insulted openly. Not confronted. Simply untreated as real. That was the method. No public rejection. Just silence. Because silence was cleaner than scandal. And it worked better. By the 1870s and 1880s, this wasn't just social preference. It was infrastructure. Families were tracked. Backgrounds checked. Friendships weighed like currency. Marriage proposals became negotiations. Then the system printed itself. Social registers circulated. Lists of acceptable households, updated like official records. The meaning was obvious even if nobody said it out loud. If your name wasn't there, you weren't part of the city's upper life. In a modern economy, money buys access to things. In this economy, access bought money. Because the right circle decided who got introduced to bankers, who was trusted in deals, who married into stability, who was safe to partner with. Reputation became a parallel financial system, one that couldn't be audited and couldn't be sued. It was social credit before banks could measure it. Mrs. Astor didn't just host parties. She ran a gate. And like every gate, it created desperation. New families tried to buy proximity. They built palaces near the park. They copied architecture. They copied manners. They hosted their own balls, hoping to force recognition through scale. But the problem was simple. You can build a mansion in a year. You can't build ancestry. So they turned to the only shortcut left: marriage. Old families protected their names like property. New money pursued those names like passports. A daughter introduced to the right rooms could trade beauty for legitimacy. A son with a fortune could trade cash for a surname that made society open. That's how the cage stayed strong. It wasn't just exclusion. It was conversion, turning human relationships into assets. And the Astors benefited twice. Their land wealth had already positioned them beneath the city. Now their social control positioned them above it. By the 1890s, Fifth Avenue north of 34th Street became a corridor of spectacle. Marble facades facing Central Park, entrances designed for visibility, ballrooms designed for crowds. These were not homes built for privacy. They were monuments built for ranking. Outside that corridor, New York was swelling, tenements, sweatshops, immigrants arriving in waves. The city's real engine lived in density and labor. But inside the cage, reality was curated. Guests moved through rooms as if the rest of Manhattan were background noise. Newspapers reported who attended events the way they reported political meetings. A social season could raise a family. A mistake could stain them for years. And the harshest truth was this: people didn't chase invitations for fun. They chased them because exclusion had consequences. Not just embarrassment, economic isolation. If the city's most powerful families didn't recognize you, you lost access to relationships that made your wealth durable. You could be rich and still be vulnerable. You could be rich and still be temporary. That fear kept the entire machine running. This is why Mrs. Astor mattered more than many industrialists. They controlled factories. She controlled legitimacy. And legitimacy decides who becomes permanent. So the question isn't why the Astors held power so long. The question is darker. What happens when survival depends on being invited? Chapter 5. Palaces Above Poverty. By the 1890s, Fifth Avenue north of 34th Street had become a controlled environment. Not wealthy, controlled. Stone mansions lined the edge of Central Park in deliberate spacing, each separated just enough to signal privacy, yet close enough to form a continuous social boundary. Iron gates, wide staircases, and uniform setbacks created the sense of a district designed for observation rather than living. Inside one of these houses, the day began long before the family woke. At around 5:30 a.m., kitchen staff descended to coal stoves to start breakfast preparations. Delivery boys arrived with ice blocks wrapped in burlap, hauled into basement storage rooms to preserve food. Maids carried hot water upstairs before sunrise because bathrooms required manual filling. Laundry was boiled in the lower floors where heat could escape through service corridors. The household functioned like a small company. A butler managed schedules and correspondence. Footmen coordinated doors and carriage arrivals. A cook planned menus days ahead, depending on guest lists. Every movement followed a routine designed to keep the upper floors quiet. By the time the family entered the dining room, dozens of tasks had already occurred unseen. Later in the afternoon, carriages lined the avenue for social calls. Guests visited for 15 minutes. Long enough to be recorded, not long enough to disrupt schedules. Newspapers the next day listed who appeared and who did not. Reputation required attendance more than conversation. Dinner required more planning than business meetings. Multiple courses, coordinated service, assigned seating, each element confirmed relationships between families. Even architecture supported hierarchy. Grand staircases allowed entrances to be witnessed from below. The houses were designed so status could be observed continuously. 8 blocks east, a different morning began. In Lower East Side tenements, entire families woke in single rooms before sunrise because beds were shared in shifts. A father returning from night labor vacated space for children preparing for factory work. Windows opened into narrow air shafts carrying sound and cooking smoke between apartments. Water came from hallway pumps shared by multiple households. Washing occurred in basins carried back into rooms doubling as kitchens and bedrooms. Work often continued inside the same space. Sewing machines beside dining tables, finishing garments for factories that paid by piece rather than hour. Where the mansion separated labor from living, the tenement merged them. A child could spend the day attaching buttons under dim light, pause for a meal cooked within arm's reach, then sleep in the same chair hours later. Privacy did not exist. Only proximity did. The distance between these environments measured less than 30 minutes by foot. Yet their residents rarely saw each other. Mansion families entered carriages through private steps. Servants purchased goods and returned through service doors. Social schedules concentrated interaction within a limited circle. Information about the city arrived filtered through newspapers, and staff who moved through streets their employers did not walk. Urban hardship became indirect knowledge. Meanwhile, the wealth produced by industrial labor and commercial trade increased property values, supporting the mansions themselves. The more crowded the tenements became, the more valuable central land grew. Growth validated the belief that the system functioned correctly. Evenings reinforced separation. On Fifth Avenue, gaslight and later electricity illuminated receptions visible through tall windows. Orchestras, formal attire, measured conversation. Outside, pedestrians paused briefly to watch before continuing downtown toward boarding houses and night shifts. In tenement districts, evenings meant extended work hours during busy seasons. Families completed garment orders late into the night because deadlines determined payment. Light came from kerosene lamps close enough to fabric to risk fire. Both environments were productive. One produced social continuity. The other produced economic survival. By the late Gilded Age, this contrast intensified. Industrial expansion concentrated labor near transport routes, while elite residents concentrated along the park. The two systems depended on each other, but did not interact directly. The mansions created an internal reality where the city appeared orderly and predictable. Carriages arrived on schedule. Staff maintained silence. Guests followed protocol. Seasons repeated with minimal variation. Outside that structure, the city changed rapidly. New immigrants, new industries, new demands for housing and transit. Insulation altered perception. When discussions of overcrowding or labor unrest appeared in newspapers, they resembled distant problems rather than immediate pressures. The families benefiting most from urban expansion experienced it as increasing convenience rather than increasing density. Confidence grew from consistency. If the environment inside the houses never forced adaptation, it seemed logical the broader environment would remain manageable as well. The future looked like an extension of the present because the present rarely disrupted itself. But architecture contained a hidden assumption. Land could remain underused if status required space. By the end of the century, that assumption faced arithmetic. Each mansion occupied land capable of housing hundreds. Each surrounding redevelopment increased pressure to justify private residence at the city's most valuable address. The social boundary had been designed to keep the city out. Soon the city would need the space inside. The richer the families became, the less accurately they experienced the environment producing that wealth. Stability within the walls created confidence beyond them. The system appeared permanent because daily life never contradicted permanence. They weren't living in New York anymore. They were living above it. Chapter 6. The war they didn't see. By the 1880s, a new type of rich man appeared in America. He did not inherit the position. He operated systems. Andrew Carnegie controlled the material cities were built from. John D. Rockefeller controlled the fuel that powered them. J.P. Morgan controlled the capital that decided which companies survived. Their wealth moved every day. Factories expanded, railroads merged, corporations formed and dissolved. Their fortunes depended on prediction, and prediction required constant change. A wrong decision could destroy millions overnight. They lived inside risk. The Astors lived outside it. Their income arrived from agreements signed decades earlier. Buildings changed tenants, businesses opened and closed, economic panics passed, the rent still came. Stability had trained them to believe time protected ownership. For most of the 19th century, it did. But industrial wealth operated differently from property wealth. Industrialists feared disruption because disruption could bankrupt them. Landlords benefited from disruption because cities reorganized around demand. For a while, both systems grew together. Then they stopped needing each other. In 1870, a building could only rise a few stories before stairs became impractical. Location determined value. Fifth Avenue mattered because movement depended on walking distance. In the 1880s, the elevator changed that. Suddenly, 10 floors produced more revenue than one mansion. 20 floors produced more than an entire block of houses. The center of value shifted upward. To developers, land was no longer important because it was scarce. It was important because it could be intensified. And intensification required capital structures, partnerships, and financing arrangements larger than inherited estates could easily coordinate. Ownership stopped being the bottleneck. Organization became the bottleneck. Railroads had already proven it. A single wealthy family could own land, but no family could personally manage a network stretching across thousands of miles. Corporations replaced dynasties because dynasties could not scale decision-making fast enough. New York began operating on the same logic. Banks financed projects worth more than entire estates. Steel companies supplied beams for buildings owners would never personally supervise. Managers replaced heirs because expertise replaced lineage. Nothing forced the Astors to change immediately. Their income still rose. And that was the danger. Because rising income hid declining relevance. Industrial fortunes fluctuated wildly, but each crisis made their leaders better at surviving the next one. The Astors faced almost no crises. Their model rewarded patience instead of adaptation. They were becoming specialists in a world abandoning specialization. The difference revealed itself quietly. Industrialists learned how the future worked. Landlords learned how the past had worked. By the 1890s, the largest economic decisions affecting New York were no longer made in drawing rooms, but in offices, financing syndicates, corporate boards, underwriting groups. Projects began requiring cooperation between institutions rather than permission from families. The Astors still owned crucial land. They no longer controlled momentum. The city could now reorganize around capital faster than inheritance could react. For decades, owning a location meant controlling development. Now development could bypass individual ownership through scale, purchasing entire districts, merging holdings, restructuring blocks into unified commercial zones. A family could wait for growth. A corporation could create it. That was the irreversible shift. The Astors did not collapse because they were poor investors. They collapsed because their advantage depended on the city moving slowly. And the city had begun accelerating. They had mastered predicting expansion along streets. They had not mastered predicting systems that could redraw the purpose of those streets entirely. By the time skyscrapers dominated Manhattan's skyline, wealth no longer respected boundaries drawn in the previous century. It flowed through agreements, securities, and organizations whose lifespan exceeded individuals. Their fortunes still existed, but its logic belonged to an earlier century. What's more dangerous, losing money, or thinking you never can? Chapter 7. The Night the Future Sank, April 10, 1912. The largest moving object ever built by humans leaves Southampton. The RMS Titanic was not simply a passenger liner. It was a statement that engineering had finally defeated uncertainty. Steel bulkheads divided the hull into watertight compartments. Electric elevators carried passengers between decks. Wireless radio connected the ship to continents beyond the horizon. Newspapers described it less as transportation and more as proof that modern civilization had reached stability. On board that stability stood Jacob Astor IV. He was 47 years old, a real estate heir whose family wealth predated skyscrapers, corporations, and federal income tax. By 1912, industrialists earned more annual income than he did, but none represented permanence the way he did. His fortune came from land positioned in the center of a city that never stopped growing. He did not need to expand it. He only needed time to continue. He boarded with his young wife Madeline, pregnant, returning to New York after travel in Europe. For him, the voyage was routine. The Atlantic crossing had become predictable. Scheduled departures, scheduled arrivals, scheduled society waiting at the other end. The world felt organized. On April 14th, the ship entered colder waters. Ice warnings began arriving by wireless throughout the day from nearby vessels. Coordinates were noted. Messages acknowledged. Speed maintained. Nothing about the ship's design encouraged urgency. It was built to absorb accidents. That was its selling point. At 11:40 p.m., a lookout saw ice ahead. The impact barely interrupted conversations in the first-class lounge. A long vibration, like a train braking in the distance. Many passengers did not even leave their rooms. Astor asked a crew member whether there was danger. He was told the ship could remain afloat with serious damage. The answer made sense. For decades, men like him had lived inside systems where structure prevented catastrophe. Financial panics came and went, land remained. Businesses failed, tenants replaced them. Cities expanded, rent continued. The idea that a structure designed for permanence could simply stop functioning contradicted experience. Below deck, 5 compartments were flooding. The ship had been calculated to survive 4. Design had a limit, and the limit had been exceeded quietly. Lifeboats were uncovered after midnight. At first, passengers hesitated. The liner appeared stable, lights bright, orchestra still playing. Leaving a functioning world felt irrational. Staying felt normal. Social order delayed urgency. Women and children were directed toward boats. Astor escorted Madeline to lifeboat number 4. Because she was pregnant, he asked an officer if he might accompany her. Permission was denied. Witnesses later described him stepping back immediately, lighting a cigarette and waiting. No argument. No panic. The rules still existed, and he behaved as if they still mattered. But the environment enforcing those rules was disappearing beneath his feet. As water filled the bow, the ship tilted forward. Elevators stopped. Passengers began moving uphill across decks. The temperature dropped below freezing. The Atlantic became visible where polished floors had been hours earlier. The change was gradual enough to remain confusing. People had time to observe the end of certainty rather than react instantly to it. By 2 a.m., the angle of the deck made standing difficult. The orchestra continued playing to maintain calm. Electric lights flickered, the first visible signal that control had limits. At 2:20 a.m., structural stress split the hull. The bow vanished first. Minutes later the stern followed, rising vertically before descending into darkness. More than 1,500 people entered water colder than survival allowed. Among them was the most recognizable representative of America's inherited urban aristocracy. His body was recovered days later. Identification came from initials on clothing and objects in his pockets. Small details remaining after a system built on permanence ended in minutes. The news reached New York quickly. Headlines focused on scale, tragedy, and technological overconfidence. Yet the deeper meaning unfolded slowly. For a century, families like the Astors had occupied a stable position in society. Their wealth did not depend on innovation but on continuity. The assumption that tomorrow's structure would resemble yesterday's closely enough to preserve hierarchy. The Titanic operated on the same belief. Both were engineered against disruption. Both trusted design over uncertainty. Both functioned perfectly, until conditions changed outside their assumptions. Within a year, the United States introduced federal income tax. Within decades, apartment towers replaced private mansions. Corporate ownership reorganized cities faster than inheritance could follow. Stability stopped protecting established positions. Astor did not see that world, but his death became its marker, not because it caused change, but because it revealed a truth. Permanence exists only until the environment supporting it shifts. The iceberg was not extraordinary. Ice had always existed in the Atlantic. What changed was confidence that systems had removed consequence from reality. The same confidence had shaped an entire economic class. The ship sank in hours. The social order it represented faded in decades. The iceberg didn't just sink a ship. It ended an era. Chapter 8, when the city turned against them. In 1913, the United States government did something it had never done before. It began taxing inherited stability. The 16th Amendment introduced federal income tax, a policy aimed primarily at the country's largest fortunes. Industrialists complained loudly because their profits fluctuated. But they could adjust prices, restructure companies, or expand production. Land could do none of those things. For a century, the Astor fortune had grown automatically. Rent accumulated quietly across decades, compounding without interruption. The system depended on time being neutral, years passing without interference. Taxation changed the direction of time. Every year now removed a portion of permanence and converted it into obligation. Wealth no longer simply existed. It had to sustain itself against continuous extraction. But the tax alone did not threaten them. The city did. By the early 20th century, New York faced a new problem. Too many people for a horizontal city. Immigration and industry compressed millions into limited space. The solution was not expansion north anymore. It was expansion upward. Elevators had already made height practical. Now economics made it necessary. A single mansion on Fifth Avenue occupied land that could hold hundreds of apartments or offices. The prestige of private space began conflicting with the profitability of shared space. Developers started calculating value per floor instead of value per address. The numbers were decisive. One family produced status point, 200 tenants produced revenue. For the first time, the Astor mansions were not symbols of wealth, they were inefficient uses of it. Pressure did not arrive as hostility. It arrived as arithmetic. Banks financed taller buildings. Retail demanded street access. Hotels generated continuous income where houses produced none. Each surrounding block redeveloped increased the opportunity cost of leaving land unchanged. The avenue itself began changing purpose. Where carriages once lined curbs for social visits, commercial traffic increased. Where invitations once determined access, storefronts welcomed anyone who could pay. Prestige shifted from exclusion to visibility. The social order Mrs. Astor had enforced required separation. Modern cities require flow. Zoning laws reinforced it. Regulations encouraged density. Safety codes required modernization. Infrastructure demanded coordination beyond private estates. Individual households could not negotiate urban planning. Institutions could. The family still owned land beneath some properties, but ownership without adaptability slowed projects instead of guiding them. Developers preferred purchasing plots outright to secure financing and redesign freely. Long-term ground leases, once a guarantee of dominance, became obstacles to redevelopment. Negotiations repeated across the avenue. Sell, convert, or be bypassed by surrounding change. The system did not confront them directly. It surrounded them. Each new building reduced the relevance of the last mansion. Each apartment tower normalized shared living. Each commercial block replaced social exclusivity with economic efficiency. The logic that had created their fortune, predict expansion, hold land, wait, now worked against them. Waiting meant falling behind redevelopment. Stability meant inflexibility. They had designed a structure meant to outlast generations. The city redesigned itself to outgrow structures. By the 1920s and 1930s, entire sections of Fifth Avenue transitioned into hotels, retail, and high-rise residences. The Astor name remained attached to buildings, but the buildings operated under corporate management and modern financing systems beyond family control. They were still wealthy. They were no longer central. No law targeted them personally. No revolution removed them. Policy, technology, and population simply aligned toward a different urban logic, one that rewarded adaptability over inheritance. The dynasty had once shaped the environment by predicting it. Now the environment reshaped the dynasty by ignoring it. What happens when the world you design no longer needs you? Chapter 9. The Slow Erasure. By the middle of the 20th century, the Astor name still existed everywhere in New York, on hotels, buildings, plaques, and charities. Yet the family behind it no longer shaped the city's direction. Nothing dramatic had happened. No financial panic wiped them out. No political movement targeted them. No public scandal destroyed their reputation. Instead, time divided what inheritance had concentrated. Large estates function best when held intact. But across generations, wealth disperses through children, marriages, trusts, taxes, and management costs. What had once been a unified property strategy gradually fragmented into separate holdings controlled by different branches with different priorities. The original fortune had depended on centralization. The modern legal environment encouraged distribution. Heirs sold parcels to simplify management. Others converted long leases into cash settlements. Some properties transferred into corporate ownership where shares replaced geography. Each decision made sense individually. Together, they dissolved the structural dominance the family once held. The transformation was subtle because income remained substantial. Members still lived comfortably, often extremely comfortably. But comfort and influence are not identical. Earlier generations could affect how the city expanded. Later ones could only react to how it had already expanded. Their relationship with Manhattan changed from architects to participants. By the early 1900s, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, built on former family land, symbolized the shift. The name endured as branding while operational control belonged to modern hospitality management. The city increasingly used the Astor identity as heritage rather than authority. Philanthropy also replaced direct involvement. Large donations funded libraries, cultural institutions, and foundations. In earlier periods, wealth secured position through ownership. In the new environment, legitimacy came through contribution. Public generosity preserved respect, but did not restore control. This transition reflected broader economic evolution. Corporate organizations outlasted families because they could raise capital continuously and transfer leadership without dividing assets. Individual dynasties struggled to maintain unified decision-making across generations whose interests diverged. The Astor fortune had been designed to endure through geography. Land could not move. But influence required coordination, and coordination weakened as inheritance multiplied stakeholders. Meanwhile, New York itself no longer depended on any single family. Financial markets, multinational companies, and public institutions shaped development at scales beyond personal estates. Decisions once determined by property ownership now emerged from negotiations among banks, governments, and corporations. The family adapted privately rather than publicly. They invested in portfolios rather than territory, in securities rather than streets. Wealth persisted but became ordinary within a world containing many wealthy individuals and entities. The difference was visibility. Earlier generations were unavoidable. Their land, houses, and social authority formed part of daily city structure. Later generations lived inside the same city without directing it. The name appeared historically, not operationally. Visitors could walk Fifth Avenue and see buildings standing where mansions once rose, unaware they were crossing ground that had defined a social order. The physical environment retained memory, society did not. Their disappearance was therefore difficult to notice. Influence reduced gradually until absence became normal. Newspapers stopped tracking their decisions because those decisions affected fewer people. They had not lost wealth overnight. They had lost centrality. The process produced no moment suitable for headlines. Each generation inherited less control than the previous one, not because of failure, but because the surrounding system no longer concentrated power in the same way. The city expanded beyond inheritance. They didn't fall. They faded. Final chapter, the last lesson of the Astors. Cities remember differently than people. Individuals measure success through lifetimes, a career, a generation, a legacy passed to children. A city measures success through replacement. Buildings rise, serve their purpose, and disappear. Streets change function. Neighborhoods change meaning. What feels permanent to one generation becomes temporary to the next. The Astors understood expansion better than almost anyone of their era. They predicted that Manhattan would grow north. They understood that density would multiply land value. They recognized that location could outlast commerce. For the 19th century, this insight was nearly perfect. But their strategy contained a silent assumption that the rules creating their advantage would remain stable long enough for inheritance to preserve it indefinitely. For decades, they were correct. People required physical proximity to work, trade, and communicate. Wealth accumulated around ports and markets. Social hierarchy stabilized uncertainty. Ownership of central land guaranteed influence because activity had nowhere else to go. Then the definition of proximity changed. Elevators expanded vertical living. Bridges and subways expanded distance. Corporations expanded scale. Communication technology expanded coordination beyond geography. The economy no longer depended entirely on fixed location. It depended on networks operating across many locations simultaneously. The city they predicted continued growing, but not in the way they built their dominance to exploit. Their wealth did not vanish. What vanished was the environment where that particular structure of wealth controlled outcomes. Ground leases mattered less when development required unified corporate ownership. Social gatekeeping mattered less when professional reputation replaced inherited recognition. Central land mattered less when economic activity was distributed across regions. Nothing about their decisions appeared irrational while they were making them. They followed logic that had worked reliably for generations. This is how long-term power often ends, not through sudden error, but through correct reasoning applied to a world that quietly changes its rules. Earlier families had lost fortunes through speculation, war, or political upheaval. The Astas experienced something subtler. Success extended beyond the lifespan of the conditions that created it. The very predictability that once secured their dominance slowed adaptation later. Stability discourages experimentation. Confidence reduces urgency. When change arrived gradually, it resembled continuity long enough to delay response. By the time adjustment becomes obviously necessary, the structure designed for permanence resists rapid transformation. Cities reward those aligned with their current form, not those who once aligned with their past form. The Astors shaped Manhattan when ownership of land defined participation in the economy. Modern New York functions through finance, technology, and organizations whose scale exceeds inherited property. The ground still exists beneath them, but value now circulates through systems less tied to any single location. Their story, therefore, carries less drama than a financial collapse, yet reveals more about how influence operates over time. Power rooted in certainty assumes tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to preserve advantage. History rarely repeats so conveniently. A dynasty can survive competition, regulation, even disaster, because those threats are visible. The most difficult threat to confront is gradual irrelevance, where each step forward seems small but accumulates into distance from the present. The Astas did not disappear because they lost money. They disappeared because they stopped understanding time. And history has a rule. The people who shape a city rarely survive the city they shape.